Good morning. I want to welcome everyone to our class. We are still in and enjoying First Kings. We're going to be looking at chapter 14 and 15 today. And it's, again, another amazing chapter in God's Word. Kind of typical. I'm going to bring up the slide deck so that we can enjoy this together. Melech Aleph, First Kings chapter 14 and 15, and just some things to cover. One of the things I like to share, always fresh and new, is anything that's coming out of any of the archaeological digs active in the state of Israel. There is a very exciting discovery that's occurred in what is called the southern part of Israel, and a great archaeological team that's done many digs over the several seasons has been very active. And I'm just going to read, and you can see the potsherd. Potsherds are very important because they are very capable, very accurate material evidence of or what they call material culture of what's going on at the time. And you can date these. And so we know very definitively what time. And so let me just read this section. It says, archaeologists working in southern Israel have found the name of Jerubbaal, scourge of the Midianites, on a broken fragment of a Judges era clay pot. This is huge. The inscription in primitive alphabetic writing from the time of the biblical judges was found in Kiryat Gat. The extremely rare inscription written in ink on a fragment of clay pot bears the name Jerubbaal. The potsherd is dated between 1220 and 1180 BCE, the time of the judges, as our biblical narrative tells us. According to Yosef Garfinkel of the Hebrew University at Sa'ar Ganar at the Israel Antiquities Authority. And this is huge. This is the first time they believe they now have material evidence of the time of the judges. Things keep coming out of the archaeological digs. If you go back 20 years ago, 25 years ago, they would say, well, there's no material evidence there ever really was a kingdom of David. Now they have found material evidence. And this is huge. So I wanted to share that with the class. Again, if you go back to your book of Judges and you read up about Gideon, his real name, Gideon, and then his title, Jerubbaal, is what we're talking here. And he was the scourge of the Midianites. So this is very, very telling. Perhaps there were a lot of people at the time named Jerubbaal, but very few would have an inscription that would say scourge of the Midianites and dated at the time, within a generation of that historical event occurring in our scripture. So always want to give you something to think about, and you can search it out. Haaretz, the news agency of the state of Israel, carried this, so have fun reading up on this. Let's move on. We're in the time now beyond Solomon. The United Kingdom has now dissipated into the two kingdoms of northern Israel and of southern Yehuda or Judah. The Philistia states have emerged again as very independent, as has Moab, Edom, Ammon, Aram, and Phoenicia. Now all once under the control and under what's called the suzerainty or the sovereignty of David and Solomon. Now they've gained independence, and Aram will become a huge issue for the future of Israel and Judah as kingdoms. Again, a very important demarcation. The glorious Temple of Solomon was built and is built, was and is the foundation in Jerusalem. Magnificent structure. This is where God intended all the tribal peoples to come and worship. But Jerusalem is in Judah, in the kingdom of Judah. And this is a political issue as we move forward. and we read the narrative today. And again, the temple was amazing. We've talked about archaeologically, they have found this amazing 10th century BCE protective wall around the Everons of the Temple Mount, again, proving that Solomon and his great building projects existed along with the very specific what they call six tower gates at Megiddo, at Hatzor up north, at Beersheba, and now at Jerusalem. They've discovered that gate at Jerusalem. I'm going to blow up this a little bit. We're going to start getting into the kings, and here is the great division. We had Saul, and Saul, of course, is killed. David takes over the kingdom. Even though there are other sons, they are killed. Some try to plot. Others are executed, if you will. It's a really sad story, but finally Solomon, Shlomo, becomes king. His son Rehoboam is the focus of still the lesson today, but the split occurs after Solomon, and Jeroboam is now leading all the 10 tribes, and he will have a very limited run. A son will survive for not many years, and then again there'll be another dynasty and yet another dynasty, and that is the sad state of the kings of Israel. Whereas the line of the lineage of David will have stability for many, many years until finally it too will go into exile. The Israelites of the north, the north 10 tribes, will go into exile earlier, and then followed by the nation of Judah at the end of their monarchical period. And so we'll review that slide constantly. Getting back, just to recap from last week, Jeroboam, having gained independence from Rehoboam and Judah, decides to set up a temple cult site way up north in Dan, and then another one at Bethel is the transliteration in English. Beit-El, Beit, house, El, God, house of God. But he sets up an idolatrous practice, and this is denounced explicitly by God, by God's prophets. And then I want to introduce, and we'll get the first narrative of the very first Pharaoh mentioned by name in the scriptures, Shishak, also in the Egyptian Sheshonk. And we have all kinds of information about this Pharaoh that occurs at the temple compound at Karnak, where he has not only a relief of his activities, his reign, his power, but very explicit on his incursion into Canaan and the conquering of many of the kingdoms to put them under his control, including Judah and even up to Israel. And this is all listed on his great, relief, if you will, at the temple at Karnak, there in Lower Egypt, or excuse me, Upper Egypt. And it says of Shishak, Sheshonk, the first, he is the first Egyptian king to be mentioned by name in the Bible, 1 Kings 11 and in 14. Solomon collaborated with Pharaoh Sheamun, 986 through 967, and arranged to marry his daughter. He's a very weak Pharaoh. We know this because no pharaohs ever gave away their daughters in alliances unless they were in a very weakened state, which only occurred after the fall of the basically the dynasty of Ramses. Solomon then reinforced Gezer with strong double walls and his 6-chambered gates. That's very clear, very clear indication that he's got a strong Egyptian influence, as he also did at Megiddo, Hatzor, and in Jerusalem. And we have found those gates. Jeroboam fled from Solomon to Shak in Egypt, 1 Kings 11:40, who welcomed him and gave his wife's sister to marry. When Solomon died in 930 BC, Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead. Jeroboam returned to Shechem the same year and became king of the northern tribes of Israel. And in 925, Shishak invaded Canaan and took away the treasury of Jerusalem or Jerusalem, including all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. 1 Kings 14. And what's amazing is we know how many shields of gold were made. We know the weight is described earlier in the Solomon narrative. And then literally written on the walls of Shishak there in Karnak, it lists all of the gold he took from Canaan, including from Jerusalem, and the weights are within pounds of what the narrative tells you, how many shields were made, their weights back at the time of Solomon, and then here's almost an accounting, like a Price Waterhouse balancing of the gold that goes back down to Egypt. And it's just God's way of saying, enough's enough. I gave you wealth, you despised my ways, and I'm taking it away from you. And what's great about it is we have great historical material evidence and narrative and written relief about Shishak. And this really codifies the whole era of Solomon and then the splitting of the kingdom with a profound historical event, and that is Shishak's campaign into Canaan and taking Jerusalem, taking the treasury, and on into Israel. And so we're going to get into the narrative. I'm going to, yes, she is not happy. We're going to find out why this woman is not happy by going to the narrative. Let's go here, and here we go. 1 Kings 14. At this time, Aviah, the son of Jeroboam, that's Jeroboam, fell ill. Jeroboam said to his wife, "Please come and disguise yourself so that you won't be recognized of Jeroboam's wife, and go to Shiloh." Shiloh's still one of the important cult sites for Yahweh, still going on that way. Micaiah the prophet is there, the one who said, "I would be king over these people." So by all means, go to the prophet who said, "I'd be king." Take with you 10 loaves of bread, some cakes, a jug of honey, and go to him, and he will tell you what happened to the boy. Jeroboam's wife did this. She set out, went to Shiloh, arrived at the house of Micaiah, and Micaiah could not see because his eyes were dim with age. Adonai had told Micaiah, "Jeroboam's wife is on her way to ask you about her son who is ill. You are to tell her thus and thus. Moreover, when she comes, she'll be pretending to be another woman." When Micaiah heard the sound of her feet, she came to the door. He said, "Enter, wife of Jeroboam. Why pretend you are someone else? I have been given bad news for you, not something you really want to hear at the very moment you go to seek out the prophet. Go tell Jeroboam that this is what Adonai says. I raised you up from among the people, made you prince over my people Israel, tore the kingdom away from the dynasty of David, and gave it to you. In spite of this, you have not been like my servant David, who obeyed my mitzvah and followed me with all his heart, so that he could do only what I regard as right. Rather, you have committed greater evil than anyone before you." Greater evil than anyone before you. Whoa. "You went and made other gods for yourselves and the images of cast metal to make me angry. But you but me you shoved behind your back." Wow. This is how God feels about this. And what he's saying is, Jeroboam, your act of evil by leading all of Israel to worship these other forms of gods, the bulls at Dan, the bulls at Beit El, have caused more evil than anything that Saul did, anything that David and his at times tragedies and mistakes and murders, and Solomon. So even though Solomon allowed his wives to sacrifice to their gods from where they were, that was very offensive to God. Yet this tells you that Israel, all of Israel, was not pulled away from the proper worship in Jerusalem at the temple. But this starts a different level of idolatry with Jeroboam. They're going to different places with different gods. "Therefore, I will now bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off every male of Jeroboam's line, whether a slave or free in Israel. I will sweep away the house of Jeroboam as completely as when someone sweeps away dung until it's gone." And if you've ever cleaned up, dog poo, you want it gone. If someone from the line of Jeroboam dies in the city, the dogs will eat him. If he dies in the countryside, the vultures will eat him. Ooh. For Adonai has said, so get up and go home. When you enter the city, the boy will die. All Israel will mourn him, and they will bury him. He is the only one of Jeroboam's line who will lie in a grave. That's amazing, because he alone in the house of Jeroboam has in him an element of good towards Adonai, the God of Israel. This is a very telling moment of theology. This says that God recognizes that children are innocent. This child will die, but this child is completely innocent. Therefore, God considers the child innocent and good. Moreover, Adonai will raise up from a king over Israel, who at that time will cut off the house of Jeroboam. And what will God do now? Adonai will strike Israel until it shakes like a reed in the water. He will uproot Israel from the good land, and when he gave to his ancestors, and scatter them beyond the Euphrates River. So already God is looking at the great Assyrian conquest that will come still a couple hundred years from now, but it's coming. Because they made sacred poles for themselves, thus making Adonai angry. And that sacred pole of both Baal and Ashtar, or Astarte. He will give up on Israel because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he committed himself, and with which he made Israel sin as well. Jeroboam's wife got up, left, and went to Tirzah. And the moment she reached the threshold of the house, the boy died. All Israel buried and mourned him, in keeping with the word of Adonai spoken through his servant, Micaiah the prophet. Other activities of Jeroboam, how he fought and how he ruled, are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel. Jeroboam his reign lasted 22 years, and he slept with his ancestors, and Nadav, his son, became king in his place. Rehoboam, the son of Shlomo, or Solomon, was reigning in Yehuda. Rehoboam was 41 years when he began to rule, and he ruled 17 years in Jerusalem, the city Adonai had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to bear his name. His mother's name was Naamah, the Ammonite. Okay, she's from Ammon. Yehuda did what was evil from Adonai's perspective. They made him angry because of their sins, which were worse than any of their ancestors had committed. For they erected high places, standing stones, and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. Also, there were male and female cult prostitutes in the land attached to these shrines, doing all the disgusting things which the nations did that Adonai had expelled ahead of the people of Israel. So things are out of control, even in Judah. Rehoboam marries a daughter of the Ammonites. Oh my goodness. So here's what God does. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, the king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He took the treasuries in the house of Adonai and the treasuries in the royal palace. He took everything, everything, including all the gold shields Shlomo or Solomon had made. To replace them, King Rehoboam made shields of bronze. Wow, what a step down. Not even silver, bronze, which he entrusted to the commanders of the contingent guarding the gate to the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the house of Adonai, the guards would get the shields. Later, they would return them to the guardhouse. Other activities of Rehoboam and all his accomplishments are recorded in the annals of the king of Judah. But there was continual war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam slept with his ancestors and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah, the Ammonite, when Aviam, his son, became king in his place. And so the narrator wants you to understand, coming into David's line, there are folks from Ammon. David had folks from Moab in his line. And so it's a very fluid genealogy that's occurring. I want to stop there and just maybe you guys have some reflection on what does it mean to gain like everything if you're Solomon, everything, and then you don't set the right foundation. What happens to it? Well, it sets up your children and your children's children down a path of wrong and evil. And Jeroboam made a political decision because he was afraid of Israel's people going down to Jerusalem to worship properly. And by setting up cult shrines, both at Bethel and Dan, he locked in a horrible, tragic destruction for Israel from the beginning. It was only a matter of time. Judah, on the other hand, continues to worship at the temple, but they allow all of this other clutter to occur. Side shrines, little side bets with the local Canaanite deities that they were still superstitious over. And with it came fertility cults with shrine prostitutes. It's just a mess. And so you have not only the worship of Yahweh going on in Judah, but also they're compromised with all of these other things going on. So just think about it. We can sit there and be very critical of Israel and Judah. Do we do the same thing? Do we have, oh, yes, Jesus is Lord, my God, but I've got these other things going on. So give you a few minutes to just think about that and meditate on that. And we're back in 1 Kings 15. We'll finish up the class. It was the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Vat, that Abijam began his reign in Yehudah. He ruled 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Okay, so his mother is the daughter of Abishalom. Micaiah would be David's granddaughter. That's who his mother is. He committed all the sins his father had committed before him. He was not wholehearted with Adonai his God, as David his forefather had been. Nevertheless, for David's sake, Adonai his God gave him a lamp burning in Jerusalem by establishing his son after him and making Jerusalem secure. For David had done what was right before Adonai's perspective. Now, we know David sinned like crazy, so this is an incredible statement of mercy and grace. So from God's perspective, David is wholehearted. That is the definition of grace. He had not turned away from anything he had ordered him to do as long as he lived, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Now, we're going to get real a little bit here and say, yes, he did do that. But actually, David did a lot of other things too. But this is the power of grace. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam as long as he lived. Other activities of Abijam and all his accomplishments are recorded in the annals of the kings of Yehudah. And there was war between Abijam and Jeroboam. Abijam slept with his ancestors. He only reigned 3 years. And they buried him in the city of David. Then Asa, his son, became king in his place. It was in the 20th year of Jeroboam, the king of Israel, that Asa began his reign under Yehudah. He ruled 41 years. That's a long time, longer than David, longer than Solomon. He reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His grandmother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Now remember, that's now his grandmother. Asa did what was right from the perspective of Adonai, as David, his ancestors, had done. He rid the land of the cult prostitutes, removed all the idols his ancestors had made. He also deposed Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made a disgusting image as an Asherah. Asa cut down this image of hers and burned it in the Vadi Kidron. That's kind of the trash heap the temple all the years. The Kidron Valley was also known as the dump. But the high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa was wholehearted with Adonai throughout his life. He brought into the house of Adonai all the articles his father had consecrated, also the things he himself had consecrated, silver, gold, and utensils. And so there's this resurgence of vitality going on in Judah under a great leader, King Asa. There was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, as long as they both lived. Baasha attacked Yehudah, and he fortified Ramah to prevent anyone leaving or entering the territory of Asa, king of Yehudah. Then Asa took all the silver and gold left among the treasures of the house of Adonai and among the treasures of the royal palace, entrusting them to his servant. King Asa sent them to Ben-Hadad, the son of Tavramon, the son of Hetzion, the king of Aram, who lived in Damascus, that's Damascus, with this message. There is a covenant between me and you, which existed already between my father and your father. This is going back to the time of David. David conquered Aram and put it under subjugation. So there was a treaty going back all these years. Here, I am sending you a present of silver and gold. Go and break your covenant with Baasha, the king of Israel, so that he will leave me alone. Ben-Hadad did as King Asa asked. He sent the commanders of his army against the cities of Israel, attacking Ayon, Dan, Avel, Beit, Maacah, and all the Kinrat, all the land of Naphtali. As soon as Baasha heard of it, he stopped building Ramah and stayed at Tirzah. King Asa then issued a proclamation requiring every man in Yehuda, with no exception, to come and carry off the stones and timber that Baasha had used to fortify Ramah, and with them King Asa fortified Giva of Benjamin, that's Benjamin, and Mitzpah. The other activities of Asa, all his power, all his accomplishments in the cities he fortified, are recorded in the annals of the kings of Yehuda. But in his old age, he suffered from a disease in his legs. Asa slept with his ancestors and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, his ancestor. Then Jehoshaphat, his son, became king in his palace. It was in the second year of Asa, king of Yehuda, that Nadav, the son of Yerovam, began his reign over Israel. And he ruled Israel just 2 years. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the example of his father and the sin through which he made Israel sin. Baasha, the son of Micaiah, from the descendants of Ishkar, conspired against him. Baasha attacked him at Gibton, which belonged to the Pelishtim at the time of Nadav, and all Israel were besieging Gibton. It was in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Yehuda, that Baasha killed Nadav, became king in his place. So here's the first time we have an assassination and the changing of a dynasty in Israel. And it'll happen over and over and over again. As soon as he became king, he killed off the entire house of Yerovam, destroying every living soul, leaving not one survivor. This was in keeping with what Adonai had said through his servant Micaiah from Shiloh. It was a punishment for the sins of Yerovam had committed and through which he had made Israel sin, thereby angering Adonai, the God of Israel. The other activities of Nadav and all his accomplishments are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel. There was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, as long as they both lived. And it was in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Yehuda, that Baasha, the son of Micaiah, began his reign over all Israel and Tirzah. And his rule lasted 24 years. He did what was wrong from Adonai's perspective, following the examples of Yerovam and continuing and committing the sin through which he made Israel sin. And so the sad state of affairs here in the narrative is that even though God fulfills his promise to kill Jeroboam and all of his line, Baasha, who takes over, turns around and does the very same thing. And now we start the cycle over and over again. No matter who comes and becomes king of Israel, the forces, the gravity, weight of continuing in the practice of sinning the way that Jeroboam had set up for Israel continues. And the only thing that will keep some of the Israelites faithful is the great cry of the great prophets that God will raise up. And we'll start covering that next week. Hopefully this class has been enjoyable. Oh, I did want to go back, and here is my picture. That's King Asa. That's Grandma. She's been up to foolishness and sin, and so he's going to chop all that down, and she's not happy, but he's going to depose her. And oh, that's a slide old from last week. We covered that already. That's it for the class for today. I hope that this helps on some reflection of what God is always expecting. And we appreciate so much everyone's attendance, and hopefully this is a blessing. Thank you so much.